Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Key to the Pastcast. My name is Ryan McLennan. I am the Director of Operations and Outreach at the Trumbull County Historical Society, and with me
is Megan Reed, the Executive Director of the Trumbull County Historical Society.
And in this week's episode, we talked to Chris Klingemier about clocks.
Oh my gosh, I love talking to Chris about clocks. I have known Chris for a very long time. When I started at the Historical Society in 2015, he was already very well known in the community, focusing a lot of his effort on historic preservation and architecture. And of course, he's perhaps most well known as a collector of clocks. And we'll hear him talk about that a little bit more later in this episode. But he knows so much about local history.
Yeah. I was struck in the conversation, but how, while this seems like a niche area, right, like a niche market, a niche thing to be interested in, it's so informative of like the 19th century Trumbull County as a whole, which I think is very cool, like turning a macro thing into a micro thing into a macro thing.
I completely agree with that. Yes, absolutely.
Right. One of the things that Chris talks about that Megan mentioned briefly was he talks a little bit about his favorite clocks from the era and how he has some of them, but he's still looking for them. So if you're listening to this and you have one of these clocks, I think Chris would be eager to know who you are. Yeah.
Yes. The man, the myth, the legend, the man who built an addition onto his house, his 1828 house, in order to house his clocks.
Right.
Chris Klingemier.
Chris Klingemier. Thank you to our sponsors.
Yes, thank you so much to our sponsors that make this podcast possible. This season is supported by Ohio Humanities and the Community Foundation of the Mahoning Valley.
Here we are with what might be the shortest bio that we've ever introduced. Hartford resident Chris Klingemier has been involved in architectural restoration projects for over 50 years, earning a master's degree in historic preservation along the way. The last 30 years have been spent researching the Ohio wood movement clock industry with special attention to the Trumbull County makers.
Welcome, Chris.
Hello.
We're very excited to have you today
Thank you for coming.
to talk about the Trumbull County clock industry, which I think a lot of people are going to be very surprised to hear about.
Most people don't know it ever existed.
Exactly. Most people, I feel like, think that, industry here started with iron.
The iron was certainly part of the clock industry, but very minor. They pulled wire and created cast bobs and bells, but I think that would be it.
So if I'm remembering this correctly, at one point in time, you told me that Trumbull County was, in the early 1800s, the number 2 producer of wooden works clocks in the country.
That's coming from Rebecca Rogers' research, and the more we've done it, the more I think we're a little bit more of a minor player, but still we were looking at upwards to 60 and 70,000 clocks having been made here between 1815 and 1835.
So why Trumbull County? What made that happen here?
They were related to the people in New England that were making them. The first folks that came out here for Trumbull County were Abraham and Levi Lewis. Levi had owned a factory in Bristol, Connecticut. Also, L.W. Lewis, I think L.W.'s name was, he used the W so nobody avoided or confused him with Levi, who was kind of a scoundrel. But they had been involved in the industry in New England. They came out here. Initially, they were buying and reselling New England products. As soon as the economy here changed sufficient, they began to move from being a distributor to a manufacturer. One of the important things with the industry, everything is based on the economics of the time. Trumbull County takes off 1799 to about 1807. Then we go very quickly to a period of stagnation from about 1808 to 1818, having to do with the War of 1812, the thought that there was an imminent invasion coming from Canada. And so nobody came out here. There's complete stagnation. No reason to try to do an industry where you're counting on selling to a populace that isn't here yet. 1817, there's a climactic and climatic problem in New England. It's called the Year Without a Summer. having to do with clouds of ash from, I think, 5 volcanoes over the past 2 years. There was, frost, killer frost, and snow every month of the year. Crops failed, and so there was a migration, really fleeing New England and heading here. When they get here, all of a sudden they need animals, they need shelter, they need everything. And in a barter economy, all of this demand attracts industry. It attracts cabinet makers. It attracts really everything. And it starts a period of about 10 years of real prosperity here. And the clock industry rides that wave, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, if we can, some of the people that were involved in the clock industry. I know you've done some research there, but like, in order to understand that better, can you give us a rundown of who exactly was making what? Like, I know you've talked in the past that the person that was creating the dials, for instance, was not the same person making the body of the clock.
The beginning of this industry goes back to Connecticut. Eli Terry, 1870, 1810. He gets financing to begin what's essentially the first mass production of interchangeable parts, truly interchangeable. And so you don't have an individual clockmaker sitting at a bench anymore. After Terry's done, you have a factory. You have a chain coming through. You've got people that are cutting and drying the timber. You've got folks that are making gears, but you might only make one gear. You might make face plates. You might be a person that's bending wire. All of these things are done, and then the batch is pulled together and they make a clock. The dials they're probably handled by several people. Somebody's making it, somebody's putting in and grinding the groundwork, someone's laying out the dial, which has to do with penciling it all in and using the stencils that we've talked about. Then you have someone doing gesso, another person doing the painting, and eventually then someone comes in and does the inking, and then the dials are packed with a peddler, and out they go along with the clocks. Mm-hmm. So mostly what we have are a lot of unknown people, and then the few names we have are either the main person owning the factory or the merchant that's pushing them. Initially, we have Abraham and Levi Lewis, who are brothers in Brookfield, and they have a factory, but apparently they never label their product. So in the research I've done, I've found, I think, 1 or 2 that are examples from their factory because they don't match anybody else's factory. L.W. Lewis is in Vienna. He owns a factory and is quite profitable immediately. He's a very wealthy man immediately and bankrupt at the end of this, as almost all of them are. Gary Lewis is a brother who is a merchant. He's in Warren, and he's apparently has a factory of sorts because his dials don't look like anybody else's. So he's having those made, but his mechanisms are coming from one of the other factories. So he's sourcing, he's outfitting his peddler wagons, and that's where he fits in. Probably the second largest number of dials marked are for him. There's another brother, Wheeler, who is initially a merchant in Warren with, I think, Levitt. He goes into the clock industry with the backing of several major money people in Warren in the 1820s, I think 26. And then there's another brother, Charles Lewis. Charles is kind of picking everything up at the end. The one that exists seems to be made from pieces from everyone else's failed industry, although he does link to an offshoot of our local industry that happens in St. Albans, Ohio. That was Charles Lewis, who was a part of setting up an offshoot of the Trumbull County industry in St. Albans, Ohio, which is now Granville, Ohio. Outside of that batch of Lewis's, there's another one. A Thomas Lewis and his father-in-law, Phineas Deming. They have, I guess, assembly facility. Thomas Lewis states that he made in excess of 20,000 dials. The numbers are big. They're always a surprise. A merchant in Brookfield, Ambrose Hart, he's active buying and selling clocks. There's a story where he actually bought a farm in Brookfield for clocks that he traded. The gentleman was going to try to sell the clocks on his way back to Connecticut, and then he turned around and he sold the farm for buttons. Because he was a merchant. Buttons were an important thing on the peddler wagons, and so he had a source.
That's good.
His brother, Alva Hart, paired with Robinson Truesdale and formed Hart and Truesdale in Hartford, Ohio, which eventually then split, and the two Hartson brothers, John and William, operated making shelf clocks there for a year. Back to Ambrose, he had loaned money to Ansel Merrill, who was a maker and had a factory in Vienna. He went bankrupt, and Ambrose bought the inventory and operated it for at least a year as Hart and Way. I think that's all the local names that appear on clocks. There's a couple other people that the records say they made clocks. One's an Asahel Scoville, but nothing shows up now with that name. So whether we just haven't found it yet, don't know.
So, Chris, how many clocks do you own?
Notice how silent this went. There's 50 or 60 or 70, somewhere in that range.
Okay.
Initially we looked only at Trumbull County. Then we discovered how the Trumbull County industry split off with a group in Granville. And eventually we went to looking at the entirety of Ohio. So there was a maker for a very short time in Medina, Ohio, but he ties in, and we'll go over that in a bit, but his wife was a dial painter for L.W. Lewis before she painted dials for him in Medina. In Concord, Ohio, there is, I don't think it's a factory. I think they're relabeling something that's coming out of Buffalo. But the name is Asa Mallory, and then there's also a Mallory and G.G. Raves. I think in each case those were merchants, and they were bartering for clocks coming across. And then there was a complete industry separate from this in southwest Ohio, starting with Reed and Watson selling New England movements, transitioning to making their own, which would be Lumen Watson, A. Reed and Company in Xenia, Orlistus Roberts in Eaton. They made some movements that were labeled for other people, but I don't think those are production. But that's kind of an overview of Ohio, and I think I have all but 5 of those people.
I had this question, I was joking with Megan that I was going to ask, which is, how do early clocks work? I feel like it's a fair question, but
how do they work?
Yeah, like the mechanics.
If I was, it's not plugged into the wall.
Exactly.
No, the power comes from a falling weight.
Okay.
So the weights are drawn up and wrapped around a barrel. That barrel has a gear that goes through 3 reductions until it gets to what is essentially the top of the clock, and at that point, it's connected to a small piece that rocks. It's called a verge. And the verge rocks back and forth, releasing one tooth at a time on this wheel. That release happens because the pendulum is moving back and forth, and each time the pendulum starts a cycle, the weight through all of this reduction gives a little push, to keep the pendulum moving. So every beat, there's that. On this wheel at the beginning, on the drum that has all of the cord on it, that's the falling weight, there's a gear on the front, and it turns and moves 2 or 3 different gears on the front, one of which tracks the hours, one is the minutes. Essentially, the whole front is just keeping track of how many times the pendulum moves. So if the pendulum moves 60 times, that's a minute. 360, 3,600 is an hour. And it's an analog, if you will, a presentation on the front as to how far it moves. At 5 minutes till every hour, there's a little wire that pops up as the minute hand turns. And that wire lifts a bar. It's called a warning. And 5 minutes later, it hits a spot where it falls. That triggers the arm that holds back the weight that falls for the strike. And it will begin to strike. And on the back, there is a wheel with slots. The slots are 1, 2, 3, 4 apart from one another. And so that wheel will turn until a little bar can drop down into a slot. So if it's 8 o'clock, that is up. It won't drop until it's gone through 8 gears, and then it drops down. That's essentially how it works. And they don't work very well.
I think it is probably something we should say that I don't think we've said yet, that the clocks that were made here were wooden works clocks. Correct?
That is kind of an important point, isn't it?
It was all wooden works, right?
Yeah,
There was
everything, the gears are cherry, the pinions are, they think they're laurel, but I don't know. They're worked out of very narrow or very thin stock, almost twigs, if you will, with a wire put in each end, and then they lay it in and spin it to turn the dowel, and then the gear goes on that. The plates, which are just about 4 by 8 pieces of oak, 3/8 of an inch thick, have holes drilled in them, and they pin together to create this frame that allows the gears to move. And that's all set on a board that sets on a perch at the top of the clock, and off it goes.
And we'll include a photo on the website, on the podcast website, of
That's
an interior of
good
one of those
idea.
clocks. So as Chris is describing this, you can go to the website and look at the work so you can follow
there's a
along.
YouTube.
Aren't you sorry you asked that
No,
question?
not at all. I think for many it'll be informative. But probably there's a YouTube clip. There's got to be one of
we
how
can
that
look
works.
for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
the technology changes. The United States, we don't have the capability to make a bimetallic spring yet. There are some made in Europe. They try all sorts of different things. They try wagon springs, for instance. So think of the very heavy, think of the leaf springs under your car. Put 2 of those in the bottom and wires going up, and you draw these up, and then they pull down to power the clock. Lots of different methods, but until the development of a really good, reliable spring, weight clocks were the easy answer.
Chris, why are you so interested and excited about clocks?
I don't have a life.
I mean, as long as I've known you, I mean, I think it's...
When I was young and stupid, we bought an early house to restore. And as I did the research, one little line in the history book said, for many years, a business in wooden works or wooden clocks was done, and the name was Hart and Truesdale. And we started hunting for them. And it was a lot of years before we found a picture of the first one. And I didn't know when to quit. Ended up doing my master's thesis on the dials. Mm-hmm. So we now know more about them than we ever should.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Chris recently built an addition onto his house to house his clocks. I think that is an important part of understanding you.
There's a lot of clocks there.
It's a very cool space.
I had a question about where they were distributed to, those wooden clocks that were made in Trumbull County. What's their reach?
Let's start with how they're done.
Yeah.
The dials were placed face to face with a little button in the middle, in the hole. And then there are stiffeners on the back that keep the clock face flat. And the end of those stiffeners, they would drive little light wire staples in to make basically a dial sandwich that they'd drop into boxes. So the dials are packed separate. Then they would have a large box with movements. Movement box might hold 200 movements. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of air to them. They're not huge. They distributed the weights in tin cans with no weight in it, so that all you did was fill it when you set it up. So they're moving very little weight, as much as they can. They're peddling in everything around our area. They're into New York. We know that Hart and Truesdale was up into western New York, where they kind of bump into another company. Western Pennsylvania, there's a lot. We see a trade route that ran Warren up through Meadville all the way to Bustine, New York. Pardon me. Certainly 422 angling down. They could easily get to the canal system. They only had to get to Sharpsville. And I think from Warren, probably the canal is in, but that's certainly an easy way to move things. So that opens up the Ohio River and all the way down. Cross country, they're going west some, but there's not a lot over there. But the other surprise, Canada. We recently found a dial that was made in Hartford, and the crest is a British coat of arms.
Wow.
Because they're peddling across the lake in Canada. They'd probably never really seen a good Canadian coat of arms. The unicorn looks a little like a fat horse with a party hat. And the lion looks a whole lot more like Bert Lahr in The Wizard of Oz than it does a lion.
That's funny.
And there's all sorts of Latin inscription on the real coat of arms. And here there's just little black lines every now and then to make you think they're letters and that you can't see well. We also have a dial where the back of it, and people tended to write on the back of these dials. It's a gift on St. Nicholas Day in Detroit, when Detroit is French. So the back of the dial is all French. But it's in the 1840s. These things are still out there. Even though the industry is done, the mechanisms are still moving.
Do you have a favorite?
A favorite clockmaker?
And dial.
Dial.
Well, the Hart and Truesdale factory being next door, that's the one we pay most attention to. And that company was the only one that survived without bankruptcy. It appears as though halfway through they changed, and they stopped making tall clocks and invested in making shelf clocks. So they've got a different product to sell. And while everybody else is still making this old-fashioned product, and in kind of a Ponzi scheme, they sell them, but they sell them on credit, come back to the bank, say, hey, look how much we're owed, let's borrow more. And they kept borrowing and making, and then when they went out of business and they were, well, not out of business, but went out of fashion and they were no longer saleable. They went from like $4 a piece to 25 cents at one point. Everybody else collapsed. Hart and Truesdale got out. They didn't end up with much money, but they didn't end up losing everything. So that's the factory I like the most. The other thing about it, dials are, if you will, grades. You can have a flat dial that's paint, no gold, no gesso. That's not a very fancy dial. And it may have very minimal paint. They just hit the corners and something in the top. Others are works of art. And Hart and Truesdale had some decorators that made some beautifully done dials. And I think those are my favorites. One of the offshoot that's in St. Albans, Ohio, also did dials that were very densely decorated. You can recognize them. If you had a whole wall, you could pick out Hart and Truesdale in a minute.
So I guess the question that I keep thinking about is, why does the industry change or like fail? Why do people fail?
Why does it fail?
Yeah, why does it fail? I mean, is it has simple to do with just like technology changes and thus?
It's a combination of technology. Well, it's all technology.
Yeah.
The beginning of this industry, Eli Terry creates a way to produce these things in mass. And the moment he fills that first contract for 4,000 clocks, he sells it and starts working on his vision for a self-contained small clock. And within 6 or 7 years, he's got prototypes. And by the time that our industry really starts to gear up, 1826 or so, he's already got the product that's going to replace it. It comes here slowly because you're not transporting a mechanism and an empty tin can. You've got 10 pounds of weights with every one of these clocks. So they don't move as easily early, but as technology changes in transportation, it's much easier to get them out here. There is a change that says this is an old-fashioned, I don't want it. And that modern clock that you can buy for $8 and it goes on a mantle rather than something that takes up the corner. They're making a product that nobody wants, but they've made it in quantity. And they can't figure out how to dump them at the end. And everybody in Warren is invested in this industry. You know, you've got the jewelers that are making hands. You've got people that are painting dials. They're loaning money. They're peddlers. The Sutliffs here were peddlers and peddled clocks. When it goes, it takes the town with it. Honestly, we kind of think that it's really the house of cards, and we're the first one to fall that starts the Panic of 1837 because they're invested in New England is invested in Western lands. And when we go in the dump and all of our values drop, it just starts to roll. So when they go, it's pretty spectacular.
Is there anything we haven't talked about with the clock industry that you think is important?
Because so many people are anonymous in this industry, it's unusual when you can figure out who somebody is. And we were able to identify a dial painter, of all things. And it's one of those happy combinations that you don't quite know why it happened. We found a clock marked H. Cook, Medina, Ohio. No information on it whatsoever, but we recognized the numerals on the dial to say it was a Trumbull County product. But when we looked at the back of the dial, it was for a different platform of works. So it wasn't made in the factory where that dial template was used. That's what we had. Completely independent of that, a lady named Alden O'Brien was researching a batch of diaries that the DAR has in Washington. And as she went through, it begins in Bristol, Connecticut. And in fact, the girl that starts it is friends with one of the families that comes out here. Her diary then comes out and she continues it after 1818, and she's in Vienna, Hartford, Fowler, in that small little corner area. And in her diary, she mentions 2 young ladies who came from the townships disappeared under the Ravenna Arsenal now. I'm sorry. But they came out, the 2 Miss Loomises, to paint dials. And then Miss Loomis, who's now a dial painter, shows up in this diary because they go on outings. And then Miss Loomis marries Mr. Cook. And there it is. There's our Horace Cook, H. Cook Medina. And so we start following, and they get married in 1822 and move to Medina at some point. At 1822, she sues Lambert Lewis for $100 of back wages and wins. Apparently, part of what she won must have been her tools, because the dial template that was used in his factory is used on the clocks that she apparently did for her husband. And she had these incredibly tiny little signature lines, very, very delicate. And we were able to match those to the work done in Lambert Lewis's factory. So we've identified a dial painter and the work she did, and that apparently things went with her. And that is, as far as I know, the only dial anywhere that we've been able to assign to a person.
You for listeners out there, you can't see Megan and I's face as Chris is telling the story, but we're engrossed in this because
so interesting.
In some ways it's analogous to like what we do, and why it's important. What we do is preserve these things so those stories can live on.
Every object has a story,
Yeah.
and the more you stare at it, the more you decode the story, I guess is the way to look at it.
Were most of the dial painters women?
Other than the fact that Mr. Thomas Lewis says he made 20,000 dials, I think that most of them were. Now, there's a fascinating lawsuit at the end of this industry between two brothers. One, Gary Lewis loans his brother $2,000, Lambert, to get him out of debt. Lambert's going to pay it back with 500 clocks. Lambert makes the 500 clocks, but during that time, the industry folds, and all of a sudden, $2,000 worth of clocks is worth $125.
That's an issue.
So one is suing the other to try to enforce. And Rebecca Rogers, who the majority of this industry discovery was hers in the 1980s and 90s, found this lawsuit. And in it, they are asked all sorts of questions because lawyers are trying to run up their money, I assume. But things like, how did you make a dial? And so now we know how they were done. And the blank has like 7 to 10 coats of white lead in oil, each one reduced with pumice. Then it goes to somebody who lays it out in pencil. That's where our templates come in. And apparently lays out the rough of the decorations at the top. Probably not any of the spandrels. From there, it goes to somebody who does the gesso work. The gesso is the rabbit skin glue and chalk that makes the raised areas. Then you've got someone that's painting, perhaps gold leaf. They paint the dial, and then the very last person to touch it inks all of the black work. Any lines that are in the decoration, and then fills in the numerals. In fact, as these kind of wear down, you see the individual lines from the pen. So a lot of people touch that dial, and it's hard to say who did what. We have a dial painter. Believe we have a dial painter in Hartford. She's the right age. She's next door to the factory, and she continues to paint throughout her life. So we think that we can identify one, but we can't put her work to her. Additionally, there are names of people that, we know they painted dials, but that's it. Their work is anonymous, not that they didn't. We know they did. We can't say they did that.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Like which ones they were responsible for.
Yeah. So the Sylvia or the Sophia Loomis Cook. That's the only one we can assign dials to.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting.
Yeah. You talked a bit about the factories.
Yes.
So my question is, what was factory life like for woodworkers and for clockmakers?
About 5 years ago, they knocked down L.W. Lewis's home.
Where was that?
That was on the south side of Old 82, across from the big cemetery that is west of Vienna Center. And we know from the diaries that there was a party there in 1818. So this house exists in 1818. We'll get into all of this another time, but it's a very substantial house at a time before we have this renaissance of people coming from New England and the craftsmen. So we don't have people here that are really very good as far, they could build a barn, but they're not going to build a fine finished interior. We had a chance to see a bit of that house as it was being knocked down. And wooden interior, very simple, but center entrance, 2-story, center steps, paired chimneys in the transverse partitions. So 4 rooms on the first floor possibly had fireplaces. Generally, it's 3 in that case. That's likely that big a house, not because he had that much money, but that's where a lot of the workers were boarded. We see the same thing in Ironmaster's house. The Ironmaster's house that's with the furnace that's in Lisbon. It looks like that man lived wonderfully, but he lived in 2 or 3 rooms, and then there was dormitory and cooking for everyone that worked at the furnace. So I think it was probably fairly cramped. Other than that, you don't know a whole lot about how they worked. It's likely the dials are going to be done in a space that doesn't have the dust. So you're going to have a paint building, likely, a production building, and I would guess most of the material is roughly sawn to size before it gets to that building. But when we think of the machinery, it's more than likely an animal on a windlass, walking in a circle, running a live axle through, and belts off the live axle down to be able to operate basically the saws and the lathes. But that's the power source. Mm-hmm. And in New England, those places generally had water power. Here, I don't think anybody had much in the way of water power. They might have had something, but nothing will amount to very much.
That's interesting.
That's super interesting. I guess the last question, Meg asked what your favorite clock is or favorite maker is. What's the clock you need in your collection?
Ooh, that's a good question. Like if you could find
if you could
one.
find it, what is it?
If I could find one right now?
Yeah. Before I go, this is what I need.
The list has 5. 2 of them I'll be able to get. The other 2, I have a picture. The other 3.
Interesting.
And I'm going to have to live with the picture.
Okay.
And if you blow it up enough and put it in a case, nobody knows. As terms of a favorite clock, Hart and Truesdale Truesdale was a cabinet maker and house builder before the clock industry and then again afterwards. His interiors are very inventive. So are his cases. My favorite clock is a pillar and scroll variation with a drawer in the base in curly maple and cherry. It is the only one known, and nobody did anything like it ever. And that's the favorite.
Okay. Is it one of the 2 that you're going to be able to get or no?
I have that one.
Okay. All right.
I have that one. There was one from Cincinnati that I lost track of it. And it was a factory worker named J.R. Smith. He was apparently paid in clocks, put his name on it, and sold it. It was in Colorado. The man died, I don't know. I've been told it was bought by a lawyer in Kentucky, but Kentucky's a big contentious state. There's lots of lawyers. So I don't know where that one is.
Just a subtle dig at Kentucky.
It was.
Sorry. There was a gentleman named Orlistus Roberts working in Eaton, Ohio. He was building a double-barrel covered bridge. He died, and his helper married his wife. I think we need CSI Eaton. But I believe the remnants of his shop were bought by a man over on the Indiana side and released, and we know of two, and it's J.R. Huff. There is one Charles Lewis known. Charles is the brother of all the other ones here, and his clock appears to be bits and pieces from everybody else who'd already gone out of business put together. And I know where that one is. Asa Mallory, I know where two of them are. And I suppose if there's one I can't get, I don't know if any Scoville exists, but I'd love to find it.
Interesting.
Cool.
That's very
That's
cool.
really cool.
Well, thank you, Chris.
Yes, thank you so
All
much.
right.
Appreciate you taking the time. So we, at the end of each of our podcast episodes, we do like an object highlight that
Oh, boy.
relates to that topic. And I'd like to bring you in for an object highlight of, so we have two clocks at the collection of the Historical Society, and one of them just happens to be in the room we're in right now, created by Ansel Merrill of Vienna. Can you walk us through this clock?
Well, first of all, its mechanism disappeared.
That's a good place to start.
It disappeared. The family that had this decided they wanted to give a clock to the Historical Society, but it needed to work. And they threw away the original interior and put a brass interior in it so that they'd have a nice clock that would make noise.
It's very sad.
It is, there's a couple things you look for. One, I alluded to how they packed dials in order to ship them. You look at this. If the dial doesn't have these little holes in the ends of the stiffeners, and you have to take the top off to see it, that tells you that it never left town. And that also helps to say the case is likely one that never left town either. So you're working with probably, well, it could easily be white or
Charles
spear.
White.
But we had a variety of good cabinet makers here.
And Charles White's shop was just north of where the First Presbyterian Church is today.
And right next to where the Adams house was. And I think that is I believe that's the family that it goes down through. The dial is unusual in that it is for a specific person. It has another name on it other than the maker.
James Scott.
Yes. And Scott's early in town and money.
He had a relatively large house at the time on the corner of High Street and Park Avenue.
That became on the northwest corner? Or no, he was on the southeast corner.
Correct.
Yes, sorry. Very typical. The case would be considered Hepplewhite, hardwood, quite tall, indicating that it's not for an average house. It's somebody with a higher ceiling. But there's not a whole lot else that you can say about it. There's not a lot to read into it.
It's pretty, like it's a standard.
It's a higher end face, and everything else is standard. The majority of these were matched with painted softwood cases. Hardwood cases are very common in the southwest part of the state, which financially was much better off. Up here, they tended to be the much cheaper ones. They must have made these cases by the thousands.